Hello, everybody. Right, it looks like we're now good to go. So, by way of introduction, I'm Alison Fenner, Executive Business Advisor at IAB Europe, and I'm to moderate today's session. Following from the publication of the IAB Europe Whitepaper on native advertising and content marketing, IAB Europe decided to host just a series of webinars that dive deeper into this topic. This webinar is the first in the series and will provide insight into how native advertising enables both publishers and advertisers to build more meaningful consumer relationships. It will outline the key stakeholders involved in native advertising and content marketing, and key roles and responsibilities. You'll be able to download the white paper from the IAB Europe website. The webinar will last approximately 45 minutes, 30 minutes for the introduction and presentations, and a minute Q&A. The recording will be available to watch and share after the webinar. A bit of housekeeping. Let's take a moment to ensure that everyone's ready and familiar with the webinar control panel. First of all, you should see a control panel on the right hand of your screen. You can use this panel by clicking the double arrow button in the upper left corner. And you can expand the panel by clicking the same button. So take a moment to practice that if you like. Also, please note there is a chat panel and a Q&A panel. To submit any technical queries or issues in the chat panel to myself, and I'll respond to these. And you can submit questions for the speakers using the Q&A panel located near the bottom of the control panel. We question live during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation with any that we haven't been able to answer as we've gone along, or that we want to share with the rest of the audience. During the session, if you need some help, you can raise your hand by clicking the red exclamation mark icon just above the chat panel. So just to be clear, technical issues are submitted to the host in the chat panel and questions for speakers in the Q&A panel. So now to introduce today's speakers. So we're really delighted to have Eloise, who is Global Director of Brand Strategy at BBC Storyworks, and Wright, who's Worldwide Content Lead as MediaCom, to speak in today's webinar. So thank you, Eloise and Libby. And move on and have a look at the content of today's agenda. So we'll talk about the IAB Europe Native Advertising and Content Marketing White Paper and our pan-European definitions by way of introduction. And the main bulk of the agenda will be dedicated to how native advertising enables meaningful consumer relationships and stakeholders, roles and responsibilities. To introduce you to the IAB Europe Native Advertising and Content Marketing Task Force, we created this task force last year, and it aims to help publishers, agencies and advertisers increase their understanding of native advertising and content marketing opportunities and good practice through harmonisation of local market, business and policy initiatives. So it's double-sided, both a business imperative and a regulatory imperative. And we've had a really great experience of both people on the regulatory side across our members and people on the business side working together on the two different aspects of native advertising and content marketing. So moving on to the white paper, one of the first key outputs of the task force was to produce an educational white paper. And this outlines many different elements that can come into play in native advertising and content marketing. The white paper provides insight on how native can build better ad experiences and more meaningful relationships. It also provides guidance for key considerations on creating and distributing native advertising. I'm going to explore some of these areas more today. So the task force has also published guidance on how to comply with EU rules applicable to our native native advertising, and these are also available on our website. So overall, the task force set out to create some pan-European definitions of native advertising and content marketing in order to have a consistent reference point across Europe and to build educational materials on a solid and firm foundation. The stage of this was to review the definitions implemented at local level, and it was clear to us straight off that native advertising and content marketing different things across the market. So with the national IABs, the task force decided to split the definition to clear about two key areas of native advertising: the distribution ad formats, and secondly, content-based advertising. The task force also agreed that the term content marketing was too general, so covering also brand-owned content such as websites, videos, etc., to refer to the specific practice of content-based advertising from which your owners earn revenue. So the task force concluded on the following pan-European definitions, as you can see there on the screen. So native distribution ad formats used for the automated distribution of content at scale, and that aligned to the style and format of the surrounding environment, and content-based advertising, commercial content that is advertiser controlled or jointly publisher and advertiser controlled. So online advertorial, advertiser funded content, or ad features, and it's designed to fit within the format and style of the surrounding editorial content. That gives you a good introduction to our starting work within the task force, and I'm going to hand over firstly to Eloise and then to Libby to talk through their presentations today. So welcome Eloise, who I introduced previously as Global Director of Brand Strategy at the BBC Storyworks. Thanks very much for participating in the webinar for us today.
Alison, thanks very much for having me. So yes, I'm going to talk through how native advertising enables meaningful relationships from consumer, publisher and advertiser points of view. So I'll do the first segment, which is the all-important consumers. So as the IAB Whitepaper outlines, when you're looking to deploy an advertising solution, you look no further than the consumer. You want to make sure that you're producing solutions that satisfy the stories and the inspiring content that they're seeking, rather than a simple advertising message. Consumers really appreciate and engage with the advertisers that contribute to their knowledge or to their entertainment. So native advertising is quite a perfect solution in that sense. It does have to be done in a way which doesn't contravene the value of trust. And also, it does need to be additive to a user's experience. So I'll be talking through those points in the coming slides. So here at BBC Worldwide, we recently discussed and conducted a global study titled The Science of Engagement, where we measured over 5,000 consumer reactions to content marketing using facial coding. We found that native content really deepens the emotional relationship between brands and consumers. In fact, brands saw a 14% uplift in the subconscious positivity towards the brands pre and post exposure to that content. And we also found that native content drives uplifts in more traditional brand metrics as well, such as awareness, brand image, and consideration. Crucial to this was integrating the brand within the narrative of the content, as drove even greater uplifts for the brands involved. Interestingly, for publishers too, the research also revealed that executed correctly and in the right environment, content-led marketing is trusted and persuasive. It works in a similar way to editorial content, sort of by helping to not only form but positively shift readers' opinions. And additionally, the study found that consumers were much more receptive to content-led marketing, where brand involvement was fully transparent. So consumers displayed a real emotional rejection of around 18% above the average for non-label content and 7% below the average where the content was fully labelled. So that increased transparency also drove more engagement across a wide range of emotions. From our perspective at BBC Storyworks, which is effectively a content agency within the BBC at BBC Worldwide. Good native advertising should be entertaining, inspirational, or educational in areas that are meaningful to its audience. If the audience don't already care about the topic of the content should be so good it makes them care. And we actually saw this sort of demand for meaningful content come through last year's campaign, with brands such as Always and Sport England really pushing envelope on meaningful topics such as gender equality. To make people care about the meaningful communication consumers are starting to demand from brands. And we saw that again this week in the range of Super Bowl ads, with Audi taking on gender equality and Budweiser and Air Canada telling really positive immigration stories. We have also heard this echoed in our recent Affluent Millennial study, revealed the high degree of meaning or value these high net worth consumers held around key social issues such as the environment. It's really important because not only do these values drive these consumers' personal actions like recycling, but it also affects their behaviours with brands. And if the brand doesn't appear to share those values, then the consumer is shown to switch off, such as the high bar consumers are measuring their brands by. So in the native content space, by allowing consumers to read, engage and think about these issues that matter to them through the native content, it's natural that these consumers form more meaningful and more trusted relationships with the publisher they're reading within, and crucially, the brands that they're reading about. Huge power to create and maintain meaning for publishers and brands through their native content. By contrast, there's also a really huge demand risk at the hands of poor native content. The upcoming Harvest Meaningful Brand Study shows how, conversely, poor native advertising can almost damage brands. Their research is showing that around 60% of content produced by brands is declared as poor, irrelevant, or failing to deliver. And for the publisher, the key to success, alongside the quality of the content produced, is the context or the environment that they provide. And as mentioned in our science and engagement research, it really showed the critical benefit of transparent signposting for native content. You can see here in these three examples on screen. And by contrast, the damage that causes when it's not there. So it's meaningful to consumers and audiences that they're not misled. Expect a lot more from their trusted publishers. At the BBC, we have a global reputation for trust to uphold, and so we place the highest premium on maintaining this meaningful relationship via our trusted environment in which we publish this native content. If we don't do that, it disables meaningful relationships with our readers and by extension with our brand partners, consumers as well. And in fact, in our Affluent Learning study, it revealed just how important trust is in their choice of even of which news provider they watch, ranking it as the #1 attribute that they look for. So each of these indicators is telling us something really interesting about native content, consumers and publishers, and the relationship between the three. And the first one is that it's powerful. It has the power to make or break meaningful relationships between brand and consumer and between audience and publisher. Secondly, that the context must be really trusted, and transparency is key here to any kind of relationship to exist. From the advertiser perspective, as per the IAB Whitepaper, native advertising brands make their message more relevant and impactful, and more effective in driving key KPIs. And the most popular ones, according to a recent WARC survey, it was traffic, time spent, and engagement. And this contains a range of benefits, including a greater opportunity to be noticed. So if the message and the native content is aligned with the surrounding content and its environment, it's likely to be noticed, as if the cognitive load is lower for the user, meaning it's easier for them to pay attention to the kind of content they're looking for. That's really important when you're considering the volume of content that people are consuming, especially through their mobile phones, where there's really limited real estate and really high competition for attention. A more sustainable and accepted mechanism. So as native advertising is more sympathetic to its environment, it's more welcomed by consumers. A recent study cited in the white paper from the University of Antwerp that as many as 86% of consumers are okay with native advertising, which is a very high number. The mechanism to segment audience and interest. So this is about being able to target exactly the right message to the right people, and that's quite key. And there's so much data out there about consumers, insights into their needs, their purchase pathways, that really is allowing the formation of more exact content. And as native advertising formats are increasingly integrated with programmatic tech stacks, the more differentiated messages and content and services can be delivered that way, even us. Finally, there's a real opportunity to differentiate brand through service. And it's about delivering helpful, relevant messaging, being of service to the consumer. And it's such a valuable way to enable meaningful relationships between brands and their consumers. The concept of native advertising is increasingly being driven by competition to deliver the most relevant and engaging content for a specific environment. So a recent example we did of this was a great Facebook canvas for DBS, telling people in the APAC region how to celebrate Chinese New Year like a pro. So there's lots of local suggestions and advice that helps the audience have an even holiday. So looking forward, for advertisers and agencies, really exciting to consider how new emerging formats and services like virtual reality and artificial intelligence drive new levels of impact and relevance to consumers and build further those customer relationships, which is so key.
We're going to move on to Libby, who's web content lead at MediaCom, and she's going to outline the key stakeholders and their roles and responsibilities involved in developing both native advertising and content marketing campaigns.
Good afternoon. So I think that one of the most complicated parts of native advertising activity is often quite how many stakeholders might be involved, and understanding how the roles and responsibilities between each party play out. And what we've tried to do here is just give some examples of how that might be applied, and to handle those in terms of splitting them between different team members or stakeholders within the process. So move forward. So we started with a media agency here. From our kind of collective experience as we put together the white paper, it seemed that often the media team tends to be the lead agency within this activity. That's often simply because of where budgets are held and the fact that native advertising activity is run using media budgets. Obviously, if that's not the case, you might find that some of these roles and responsibilities flex. Similarly, you might consider that you have different stakeholders within your own structures or teams. So firm and fast, and there is obviously some adaptability that might need to be tailored to your own situation. However, if we consider that for the most part the media agency leads this kind of activity, then the kind of roles and responsibilities that they would take on would be predominantly project management, so overseeing the development of a media plan, so not only content creation, but also how media is supporting amplification of that content, as often they're dealt with together. Contact and liaison, so that normally the media agency, because they are lead, tend to communication between all parties and oversee sort of the general development of content plans, both taking into consideration the client's desires and objectives, but also balancing that and with, as Eloise put it, very much the brand integrity and ensuring that the outcome is of quality content rather than poor content. They can oversee content development, both from a production side in terms of, if there is a shoot that they might need to be present at, or reviewing things like design and infographics, making sure that all of those pieces are both in line with the brief, so in line with any branding considerations that there might be. Important part, and again, these referred to measurement and ensuring that KPIs are very much set out as part of native advertising activity, and the media agency will be there to review the data, review the results, and ensure that they are reported on correctly. And finally, it seems probably the most minor and is actually probably the most important is status updates. I think advertising activity often runs for significant period of time in terms of weeks, and as a result, especially when you're handling multiple pieces of production as well as advertising, and those things all come together across multiple stakeholders, regular communication and status updates is absolutely key, and on the media agency will be the one to collate that information and communicate it out to the group. As well as the media agency, obviously the partner is the media owner themselves. Very much in terms of execution in response to the media brief as written by the media agency, and provision of delivery data and reporting. Though obviously content creation is that part of the brief and part of the activity. They might need to manage third-party relationships. So, for example, with the BBC, if they are working with journalists or other creators, it might be that they're managing those relationships to help deliver against certain content deliverables, and ultimately helping ensure that the campaign delivery is running to agreed timelines. We have obviously the client as a key stakeholder. Apologies for that in the background. The client's job is obviously to deliver a really solid brief. What we need to understand most is the objectives that are in hand. Native advertising, as Eloise stated, is an incredibly powerful tool, but only when we know the job that it's trying to achieve. I think understanding that objective and ensuring that the partner is aligned with that we have the right partner to do that job, and that we're creating the right content to deliver against it is really key. So the client brief is actually an incredibly important part of any native advertising activity. As the activity progresses and develops, it's also very important that the client can provide feedback at different stages to ensure that the content being produced is in line with their expectations and in line with delivering against their objectives. They'll also need to, at different stages, provide approvals. Now, this will depend on the agreement with the partner. In some cases, they will have final approval of all content, and in some cases that might not be always possible, especially, for example, if it's live reporting. But whatever is agreed, the client needs to be aware of what's required of them in terms of approval and deliver against that. They also, in some instances, have input in terms of production. That's very dependent on your client and their setup, and also what in-house resources they might have or want to be using. But that's a consideration depending on the brief in hand. And finally, we have the creative agency. I mentioned that in most experience, the media agency is lead agency on this particular type of activity, but creative agency here also could represent a number of other agencies. So, for example, we're well aware that some clients have social agencies, digital agencies, content agencies, etc. Whatever other agencies are involved, they're obviously all stakeholders, and the roles that they play will vary. For the creative agency, which is probably the most common other agency that we would include within our group of stakeholders, as brand guardians, they will often be responsible or liaised with and consulted with when it comes to things in regards to how the brand is represented. So guidelines and logos, ensuring that the content is in line with other brand metrics, and creating any branded assets as well. So it might be as part of the overall creative for the commerce plan that there is some partner linked assets as well, and that they would take the lead on helping develop and create those. And similarly, we would want them to be part of both statuses and feeding back wherever is appropriate. So that's an overview of sort of the key stakeholders that we have. As I mentioned, we have many others that could be involved in different ways, and so this is not a finite list. but it should give a good view of how we believe those stakeholders can interact and how those roles and responsibilities split out.
Very much, Libby. I think probably what would be great to do now is if we could get the conversation going between the two of you with a couple of questions. Obviously, you, Libby, referred to Eloise's presentation a bit as you went through there, and I think they were both really great presentations and certainly a lot of food for thought. So maybe just to kick off, we could talk a little bit about what trends you see in native advertising. So I was going to kick off with Eloise, because you outlined how native advertising can enable the more meaningful relationships, and how you see it evolving as native advertising becomes more widespread and common practice, as indeed it is doing.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two main areas there. I think, like I was mentioning about the the breadness we're seeing of brands moving into advertising that's really picking up some pretty big issues. I think that the more we'll start to see that more and more as brands are feeling a bit encouraged by each other maybe to start playing in that space. Again, though, as Libby said, it does depend entirely on the client's brief and objectives, and many brands don't want to play it. But for the ones that do, I think that's going to be a big driver for meaningful relationships for consumers with brands and through the publisher who's willing to publish and co-create that sort of content with them. And the second area I think that's important that the top of mind in the context that we're at the moment is that the net content that is being produced is being done so in a way that's highly transparent and in a highly trustworthy manner. In this time of a lot of fake news, the emphasis definitely is on trust. So it's suddenly taken on a whole nother degree of importance, I think, particularly in this space as well.
Yeah. And I guess coming on to the agency perspective, given that Libby outlined all of these different agency stakeholders that could be involved and the need for brand guidelines, I guess this is presenting more hard work and more of a challenge for the agency, Libby, you think, in terms of making sure that all of this is curated and marshalled correctly?
I think that that's definitely correct to a point. I think that I would echo Eloise's point about transparency being crucial, though. I think that her comment earlier that content does more damage than it does obviously good. I think that that's an incredibly important point, and I think that transparency and a lack of trust or credibility can very much contribute to that bad content. And I think the other thing is also in terms of the impact. I think that one of the conversations in terms of the trend we're seeing when we're doing more kind of content-led activity, we're having a lot of measurement conversations, ensuring that when we do this activity, we can measure the impact. And I think that transparency is a really important part of that, because you want people to know that your brand is doing that work. Otherwise, impact is sort of mooted. So I think that that's very much a conversation we're having a lot of. And I think the other thing, and Eloise touched on it, but I just would like to raise it again, is the innovation aspect. I think that publishers are actually responding in most incredible ways in the sort of sphere of content, in terms of virtual reality, in terms of 360, in terms of very rich and dynamic content. I think that's really exciting, and I think that it's stuff that maybe brands wouldn't be brave enough to try by themselves. But when you work with a partner that is experienced and has such a sort of high quality background and the energy and enthusiasm for those new things, and it's a wonderful thing to tap into and really leverage for brands. So I think that those things are certainly positives, but yes, there are lots of things we have to be wary of. I think transparency is one of them, measurement is the other.
Yeah. Do you have further comments on that, Eloise, particularly on the measurement point, which I guess we haven't explored so much so far?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time for content marketing and native content. It's new for many brands, but we're sort of, I suppose, in its third or fourth year of growth for many markets. So it's not reaching a point of sophistication, but it has been around, and I think it's interesting that the three the key three KPIs from the WARC study were that they're the basics, aren't they? They're sort of time spent, engagement, and so on. But when we're thinking about what it is we're producing here, it's an emotional moment with someone, consumer or audience, and so I think that's kind of where there's now for a bit more of a sophisticated metric potentially. That's what we were trying to look at in the science and engagement study is, what sort of emotions are we drawing from these people, and what does that make them want to do with that brand? Would they buy it, or would they think about it in the future? Do they think better or worse about the brand? It's a whole other sort of emotional sort of on top of those sort of three basics. So I think that's a big area that's gonna come, and that I think probably brands are a bit ready for, because it's quite an exciting way, I suppose, to talk about the success of your campaign. It makes a lot of sense.
Thanks. So we've had a few other questions coming through from the audience, but they're quite diverse. So I think probably what we'll do there is we'll kind of collect them together and see if perhaps we can address those in the next webinar, which is coming up in a week's time, next Tuesday afternoon. And I think we need to do a bit of bringing back to some of the audience to get them in context. Certainly had a lot of responses from the audience to today's webinar. So thanks to the audience for that, and thanks to you two for giving us such insights. So what remains for me today is to thank you two for joining us. So the next steps will be that the webinar recording will be available on our website in the next couple of days. As I mentioned just, there will be a further webinar next week, Tuesday the 14th of February at the same time. We'd be really grateful if you could share your feedback in the survey at the end of the webinar. And as we've suggested, do please go to the IAB Europe website and download our native advertising white paper. So last of all, I'd just like to remind everybody that IAB Europe's Interact conference is happening on the 23rd to the 24th of May in Amsterdam. At the conference, we will have our Mix Awards presented at the gala dinner on the evening of the 23rd, and within that, there is a native advertising category. So if you have a award-winning and you would like to enter these for the IAB Europe Mix Awards, please don't hesitate to either ask us any questions about it or go to the Interact website and find out about entering those awards. Thanks very much, everybody, for your attendance today, and look forward to speaking to you again in next week's webinar. Thank you.